Breaking news regarding a tragic aviation disaster. A plane crash in Saudi Arabia, Flight 163, has claimed more than 300 lives after catching fire.
On the tarmac at Riyadh International Airport, August 19, 1980, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar sits motionless under the desert. Fire trucks surround it. Rescue crews stand ready. The engines have finally stopped spinning.
From the outside, the aircraft looks intact. No broken fuselage, no shattered wings, no visible damage at all. This is not a crash site. This is a successful emergency landing. And yet, inside that perfectly functional aircraft, 301 people are already dead. The question investigators would spend years trying to answer wasn't what brought the plane down. It was why no one got out. Saudi Flight 163 departed Karachi that afternoon carrying pilgrims, workers, and families. The first leg to Riyadh was uneventful. After a brief stopover, the aircraft pushed back from the gate at 9:08 p.m. for what should have been a routine 55-minute domestic hop to Jeddah. In the cargo hold beneath the cabin floor sat a mixture of personal luggage, commercial goods, and items that in 1980 were not heavily scrutinized by security. Camping stoves, containers of diesel lubricant, and other flammable materials that would later be found in the wreckage. At the time, many travelers on routes popular with migrant workers routinely carried such items. No one questioned it. 6 minutes and 54 seconds after takeoff, a chime sounded on the flight deck. A warning light illuminated on the flight engineer's panel. Smoke detected in the C3 cargo compartment, the rearmost baggage hold under the aft cabin. Standard procedure dictated an immediate response. What happened next would become one of the most scrutinized sequences in aviation history. The captain, relatively inexperienced on the TriStar despite his seniority, hesitated. One smoke detector triggering could be a false alarm. He continued the climb. Nearly a full minute passed before the second detector in the same compartment also activated. Now there was no ambiguity. Both sensors agreed. There was smoke in the cargo hold. Yet the aircraft kept climbing, passing through 15,000 feet, then 20,000. The flight engineer began searching for the correct emergency checklist. He looked in the wrong section. Seconds became minutes. By the time the captain finally located the procedure himself, more than 4 minutes had elapsed since the first alarm. The TriStar was now at 22,000 feet and more than 60 nautical miles from Riyadh. Here's where the story takes its first unexplainable turn. The C3 compartment was classified as Class D under regulations at the time, a designation that assumed the space was essentially fireproof. The theory was that any fire inside would quickly consume the available oxygen and extinguish itself before breaching the structure. Because of this assumption, Class D compartments were not required to have built-in fire suppression systems. Investigators would later determine that this regulatory logic was based on tests conducted in much smaller cargo spaces. The TriStar's C3 hold was significantly larger, containing far more air than the test models. A fire there could burn longer and hotter than anyone had planned for. Some aviation safety experts have questioned whether manufacturers and regulators knew about this discrepancy before 1980. No conclusive evidence has surfaced, but the timing of subsequent regulatory changes raises eyebrows. As the flight engineer finally stepped into the cabin to assess the situation, passengers in the rear were already moving forward, away from thickening smoke. He returned to the cockpit and reported fire. Not smoke, fire. That single word should have triggered an immediate emergency descent and landing. It did not. The captain's decision-making from this point forward remains a subject of debate among investigators. He turned the aircraft back toward Riyadh, but instead of descending aggressively, he continued a gradual climb before leveling off and beginning a standard arrival pattern. Air traffic control was informed of a smoke problem, not an uncontrolled fire with flames visible in the cabin. The communication gap would prove fatal. Behind the cockpit door, the fire was no longer contained. It had breached the fireproof liner of the C3 compartment and entered the space beneath the cabin floor, a channel that ran the length of the aircraft, providing a pathway for heat, smoke, and toxic gases to spread forward. Cabin crew attempted to fight what they could see with handheld extinguishers, but they were spraying its symptoms. The main fire remained hidden below their feet, feeding on insulation, wiring, and structure. What investigators found most disturbing was what happened after the landing. The approach was stable. The touchdown was controlled. The TriStar stayed on the runway, rolled nearly its entire 13,000-foot length, turned off onto a taxiway, and came to a stop. A textbook emergency landing by any measure. Fire crews were positioned and ready. Rescue was seconds away. Then, nothing happened. For more than 3 minutes after the aircraft stopped, the engines continued to run. Fire trucks could not approach. Standard safety protocols prohibit ground personnel from opening doors or deploying slides while jet engines are at power. The exhaust blast can injure people and damage equipment. Inside the cockpit, the captain and flight engineer worked through shutdown checklists at a pace that, in hindsight, seems incomprehensible. Radio calls to air traffic control were calm, almost routine. There was no urgency in the voices, no sense that 287 passengers and 14 crew were breathing superheated toxic smoke in a sealed cabin. When the engines finally spooled down, rescue teams rushed to the doors. They found them closed. They tried to open them from the outside. The doors would not budge. The TriStar's pressurization system had been left in a standby configuration. Cabin pressure remained higher than outside air pressure, effectively locking the plug-type doors in place. Firefighters struggled for minutes against both mechanical resistance and rising heat. By the time they forced one door open, more than 23 minutes had passed since touchdown. 3 minutes later, the interior flashed over. Flames erupted from windows and openings. When crews finally entered, they found all 301 people inside. The flight deck crew was still strapped into their seats. Passengers were collapsed in forward aisles where they had fled. Most showed no external burns. They had been overcome by smoke long before the final fireball. Investigators faced a grim task, explaining how a successful emergency landing turned into a complete loss of life. The cockpit voice recorder provided the technical sequence of events, but raised as many questions as it answered. Why did the crew never use the word emergency in their communications with air traffic control? Why was there no command to evacuate immediately after landing? Why did the captain allow the aircraft to roll the full length of the runway instead of stopping as soon as the wheels touched down? Some of these questions have official answers. The captain's training record showed difficulty adapting to off-script situations. The first officer was young and low on experience. The flight engineer had failed previous checks and was relatively new to his role. Together, they represented what investigators called an unusually weak crew pairing. But other questions linger. Transcripts show that after the flight engineer reported fire in the cabin, he later described it as just smoke in the aft. This contradiction has never been fully explained. Did he misjudge the severity? Was he trying to avoid panic? Or was there pressure, cultural or professional, not to escalate the situation? In the 1980 regulatory environment, Saudia, like many airlines at the time, operated under procedures that prioritized following hijacker demands over fighting them in flight. This was before modern crew resource management training. Pilots were taught to fly, not to make split-second life-or-death decisions about when to override protocol. But Saudi 16-3 was not a hijacking, it was a fire. The captain's apparent belief that he could manage the situation with checklists and a standard approach suggests either a catastrophic misreading of the threat or an expectation that procedures would somehow save them. Neither proved true. What investigators found most unsettling was the systematic nature of the failures. If any single link in the chain had been different, if the crew had descended immediately, if they had stopped on the runway, if they had shut down engines faster, if the pressurization system had been configured correctly, if the evacuation order had been given the moment the aircraft stopped, some people, perhaps many, might have survived. Instead, every decision compounded the previous one. In the aftermath, regulatory bodies around the world moved quickly to reclassify cargo compartments and mandate fire suppression systems. Airlines revised training programs. Cockpit door security procedures were updated. But for the families of those who died on Flight 163, these changes came too late. They were left with a more fundamental question that still echoes today. How does a modern airliner land safely, sit intact on a taxiway surrounded by emergency equipment, and still lose everyone on board? The official report cites pilot error, inadequate training, poor crew coordination, and flawed regulatory assumptions about cargo compartment fire behavior. It does not, however, explain why a sequence of failures this comprehensive happened on this particular flight. Some investigators privately note that the sheer number of things that went wrong, each one preventable, each one compounding, strains the boundaries of probability. Decades later, the case of Saudi 163 remains a reference point in aviation safety courses, not for its crash, but for what happened after the crash that never was. It is studied as an example of how the window for survival can close while an aircraft sits motionless on the ground. It is a reminder that landing gear on pavement does not equal safety. And for those who look closely at the timeline, the decisions, and the unanswered contradictions in the crew's own words, it remains one of the most preventable disasters in aviation history, and one of the hardest to fully explain.